American plastics recycling doesn't exist. At least not like you think it does. The whole American idea of a grand-scale unified curbside plastics recycling system, where your plastic waste is whisked away to a high-tech facility and melted down and reformed into new magical shapes, that whole thing is a facade, a big trick. And it's one that's been crafted and finessed over nearly a century by large corporations and manufacturers. The actual reality of plastics recycling in this country is grim. According to National Geographic, out of all the plastic we've ever created, only 9% of it has been successfully recycled. But low recycling rates really are just the tip of the iceberg. The full picture is pretty dark. The truth of it is that from the beginning, plastics recycling in America was just not actually designed to work. Its real goal was social control and profit management. Nearly all of America's plastic waste, even the stuff that gets picked up by your neighborhood recycling truck, gets landfilled or burned in the end, either here or abroad. And this isn't something new. Plastic has just never been a recyclable material. But the fact that most people think it is probably one of corporate America's biggest achievements of the last 100 years. Plastics recycling, it's a corporate scam. If you're like me, hearing that was probably a little shocking. When I was a kid, my socially liberal Gen Xer on the tail end of the hippie movement mom always told me that shopping at Whole Foods Market and diligently recycling my almond butter jars were the two most important things I could do to save the world. But we all know that Whole Foods is just another colony of the Jeffrey Bezosian empire now, and those almond butter jars are probably still sitting in the same landfill they were tossed in 1997. I don't think my mom was lying to me though, at least not on purpose. She was misinformed, indoctrinated even, because she grew up in an era when stuff like this happened.
Some people have a deep, abiding respect for the natural beauty that was once this country. And some people don't. People start pollution. People can stop it. Write for Pollution Booklet, Box 1771, Radio City Station, New York.
So yeah, the 70s were ridiculous. That guy's name was Iron Eyes Cody, but his real name was Aspera De Corti. He was an Italian-American actor who made an entire career out of portraying Native American characters in PSAs like that one, and Western films and commercials. He even actually claimed to be a Native American in real life. I found this picture of him giving Jimmy Carter a headdress. I didn't really look up the background on this image, but I just wanted to include it because the 70s were ridiculous. But anyway, the part of this PSA that I really want to focus on today is who made it and paid for it. Keep America Beautiful, Inc. That's a pretty innocent-sounding name for an organization that might be doing important social work at first glance. And Keep America Beautiful was hoping that most folks wouldn't consider what they were saying all too critically. People start pollution, people can stop it. But before we dive into the problems with that idea, let's find out a little bit about who exactly Keep America Beautiful even is. Keep America Beautiful is not a group of well-meaning eco-warriors who decided to wake people up to the realities of mankind's pollution of the environment. Keep America Beautiful is just another arm of the propaganda machine. Keep America... Alright, I'm just gonna call them CAB from now on, because it's a lot less work and I'm really tired of repeating this geniusly deceptive moniker. So, CAB had already been around for a few decades by the time that Mr. De Corti shed his disingenuous tear in that PSA in 1971. CAB was created in 1953 by a collection of businessmen and nonprofit board members, most notably people from American Can Company, Owens Illinois Glass Company, and the U.S. Brewers Association. So that's glass bottles and aluminum cans. The big trick of plastics recycling didn't come out of nowhere. The infrastructure and ideology that has allowed corporate America to get away with this unchecked pollution for decades was developed slowly and steadily over many years, with its origins coming long before plastic was even ubiquitous. And it all started with bottle makers and beverage companies. So before World War II, pretty much all the glass bottles in the country were reusable. Consumption of soda and beer just wasn't really done at home. We're talking about the era of the soda fountain, when neighborhood kids would all gather on the weekends and run down the block to the soda fountain to have a Coke, and beer was mostly consumed in bars. There wasn't a huge market for bottles that the consumer could take home with them. But for bottles that did leave their point of origin in a customer's hands, there were bottle deposits, where you could make a little money back on your purchase by returning the bottle for reuse. There's still bottle deposits in a handful of states in this country, and they mainly came about in the 70s and 80s, but modern bottle deposits are a little bit different than the ones of the 30s and 40s. But I'll get more into that later. Basically, the point is that beverage companies in the 30s and 40s had not yet consolidated their packaging operations. So instead of handling the whole process from start to finish like they do today, they were outsourcing their packaging to regional bottling and canning factories. These facilities were purchasing product from Coca-Cola or Pepsi or Budweiser and buying bottles and cans from places like Owens Illinois Glass or the American Can Company, combining the two and selling the finished product to stores in whatever region they were based in. Most often, though, they were washing out return bottles and reusing them. This system of decentralized bottling was the main structure keeping the widespread adoption of disposable packaging at bay, and it worked for quite a while, and everyone was pretty happy with it. American beer companies were the first ones to get rid of the reusable bottle as early as the mid-30s, but that was more to do with prohibition really than anything else. Basically, the only beer makers left standing after the 14 years of prohibition were the big three, Anheuser-Busch, Schlitz, and Pabst. Most of the smaller independent brewers disappeared with prohibition, so there were these huge swaths of untapped beer markets when beer became legal again in 1933. So to get their beer to as many disparate American towns who suddenly lacked a local brewery as possible, the big three brewers centralized their bottling and started shipping out pre-bottled and canned beer as quickly as they could. This was the first hint of the rise of disposable packaging in the US. When the war ended in '45, there was suddenly a massive amount of manufacturing infrastructure that was just suddenly unutilized. Post-war America ushered in the beginnings of throwaway consumer culture with this manufacturing boom, and in just a few short decades, reuse would no longer be seen as this core American value. No more leaving your empty milk bottles for the milkman. No more claiming your bottle deposit at the soda fountain. America's love of throwing things away was only just beginning. Here's a non sequitur for you. In the early 50s, Vermont was a mostly rural state. This'll connect, just give me a minute. In 1950, of the population of 377,000, only like 35% lived in the state cities, and that's the biggest urban population Vermont had ever had. The rest was farmland. Vermont really hasn't changed too much population-wise. Did you know that Burlington, Vermont's currently most populous city, is the least populous city in the country to be a state's most populous city? Wrap your brain around that one. And Montpelier is the least populous state capital. The point is, not a whole lot of people live in Vermont. And in 1953, like half as many people lived there as they do now. But the people who did live there, mainly farmers, decided in early 1953 that they were really fucking sick of their cows stepping in broken glass. There's a culmination of factors here. The beer industry's aforementioned early adoption of disposable bottles meant more trash, and the slow but steady growth of Vermont cities meant more roads around the state, and more roads meant more cars full of stupid city folk tossing stupid beer bottles out the window, and more bottles out the window meant more broken glass in the cow pasture. And just when is enough a fucking enough already, the Vermont Farm Bureau wondered, and they commanded a lot of political and economic influence in Vermont in the 50s. And also, it's only been 20 years since beer became legal again, and we all know the government don't move fast, not in Vermont, so it should come as no surprise to you that both the Vermont Senate and the House of Representatives still, in 1953, had a committee called the Temperance Committee. And do you think the Temperance Committee liked all these broken beer bottles any more than the Farm Bureau did? You bet your ass they didn't. So that's why Vermont, in 1953, passed the first ever bottle bill in the US, banning non-reusable beer bottles in the entire state. It only lasted for a few years, and it wouldn't really be until the 70s that any similar legislation was passed anywhere else, but it had far-reaching effects. Remember what else happened in 1953? Yeah, Keep America Beautiful, like right after this bottle bill passed. The bottle bill scared the shit out of all the people making buckets of money selling disposable packaging. They saw it as the beginning of an all-out assault on their industry, so they started this tricky little nonprofit, gave it this cutesy little name, and started making ads. Cab's first major ad campaign was Stop Being a Litter Bug. These were on billboards, magazines, pins, buttons. The people at CAB may even be the first ones to use the term litterbug, but that's debatable. What's certain is that as soon as the industry saw their products getting banned, some quick thinking happened. Why were the bottles banned? Well, partly it was because of Vermont's state-sponsored anti-beer attitude, but mostly it was because of the disposability of the product and its swift transformation from useful to garbage. Sometimes garbage becomes litter, and lawmakers in Vermont saw this as a problem with the product, not the consumer. In their mind, it made a lot more sense to ban the product than to try to police littering statewide. CAB, of course, had a problem with that, and they came up with this idea, one that would have dire consequences. You see, what they were trying to do with the litterbug campaign, in a really subtle way, was convince the American public that the proverbial broken glass in the cow's hoof was not the fault of the bottle, but of the drinker. Well, if your so-called civilized Vermontians weren't all such litterbugs, you wouldn't have to tug all that broken Budweiser bottle out of Bessie's foot. It's deceptive because it sends a positive message initially, one that no reasonable person could really disagree with. Yeah, it's bad to litter. Yeah, people should litter less. But to CAB, this wasn't about Bessie's foot. It was just about the bottom line. The problem, once again here, is that it's all a facade. The campaign did seem to reduce littering, but what is littering but highly visible waste? Litter cleanup initiatives alone don't really do anything, besides make consumers feel better about themselves and, in turn, feel better about buying more disposable packaging. Litter cleanup shifts the locale of the waste and makes the problem less visible, but there's no significant change happening. The waste still gets landfilled or burned or slips into the ocean, and production doesn't slow. CAB's next significant campaign wouldn't come about until the dawn of the 1970s, when years of work by activists and lawmakers culminated in the first Earth Day. The late 60s had seen a notable uptick in visible signs of humanity's effect on the environment, most prominently the Santa Barbara oil spill off the shores of Southern California in early '69, and Cleveland's Cuyahoga River catching on fire just 6 months later. A social mobilization catapulted a series of organized protests and sit-ins in early 1970 into the most significant environmental demonstration of the time, effectively jump-starting America's modern-day environmental movement. By the end of that year, the EPA was created. Environmental issues were on the forefront of American minds, and CAB knew that pretty soon they'd probably need to dodge another bullet. Now, by 1971, CAB had expanded and brought in members of this PR company called Burton Marsteller. These guys are most famous today for creating an entirely fake grassroots movement of anti-smokers to help prop up the tobacco industry in the 90s, but that's a topic for another video. I only mention it here to demonstrate that these were some pro-level propagandizers on board. They're the ones who came up with Iron Eyes Cody and the Crying Indian, people start pollution, people can stop it. It's just a modernized redux of the same message from the 50s and 60s. We've got nothing to do with this whole pollution problem, y'all. If you change things on your end and let us keep making money, everything's gonna be okay. So the social shift of environmentalism in the 70s from a fringe concern to a mainstream worry did have many positive effects. It led to environmental legislation, a general reassessment by the public towards environmental concerns. In the world of waste management and corporate accountability, however, little was actually changing. In fact, things were just getting worse. By the late 80s, the magic of Iron Eyes Cody had worn off entirely, and people were starting to get upset again. The most visible example of America's waste problem in the back half of the 80s was the infamous Mobro 4000. This was a barge filled with 3,100 tons of trash that sailed all the way from New York to Belize and back in search of a landfill. The story of this ship is really an interesting one, but I'm just going to sum it up here. In '87, New York City, like pretty much all American cities at the time, was just running out of places to put its trash. The landfills were full, and they couldn't burn it all fast enough. They literally had nowhere to put 3,100 tons of trash. So they stuck it on this big-ass barge and decided they'd ship it down to North Carolina. The idea, I guess, being here is that North Carolina had a way less used incineration system and they'd be able to process the waste when New York couldn't. But it really didn't end up mattering at all, because before the load even docked, the North Carolinian News got a hold of the story, reporting that it was contaminated with soiled diapers and used syringes and couldn't even be processed. It's unclear if this was even true, but the backlash it created amongst the public prompted the state of North Carolina to refuse the load, the first of many governments to do so. The Mobro 4000 would be refused docking by several more American states, as well as the nations of Belize and Mexico, before eventually returning home and docking in New Jersey after 4 months on the open seas. The story of the Mobro spread, and it quickly became an emblem of America's waste problems, with media across the nation terming it the Gar Barge. Activists from Greenpeace even managed to get aboard the vessel and installed a giant banner that read, "Next time, try recycling." This image spawned national conversation, and the problem of what to do with disposable products was once again towards the forefront of the collective American consciousness. Over the years, lawmakers and environmentalists would make many efforts to substantiate the importance of the first two R's, reduce and reuse, but thanks to widespread corporate lobbying and greenwashing, the third R, recycling, would come to be seen as the only applicable solution. Pretty much our entire modern conceptualization of how a recycling plant looks and acts was designed by the beverage and container industries in the 70s and refined in the coming decades by the plastics and packaging industries. Way back in 1969, CAB branched out and started a standalone nonprofit called the National Center for Resource Recovery. And after 4 years of trying, in 1973, the NCRR secured a deal with the city of New Orleans to implement a recycling system there. The entire project was funded by the container industry. Then in 1976, American Can Company launched a recycling plant in Milwaukee and called it Americology. This facility bore striking resemblance to modern plants, from the terminology and classification of materials to the methods by which the waste was actually processed. Americology gave us the first hint at what would become the prevailing method for plastics recycling in America, single-stream recycling. This is where all different kinds of plastics are commingled at the consumer end and then separated back out into their different categories at the recycling plant. But within just a few short years, both of those plants had closed. Even with corporate money backing them, recycling without federal funding was just not a sustainable model. In order for it to really take off, it needed to be subsidized, and the industry had a plan. Now, the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act of 1976 is the foundation upon which all modern solid waste disposal is built. But this wasn't brand new legislation, it was an amendment to an amendment. The original act passed by Congress to deal with the country's waste came about 10 years earlier. The decade of the 1960s was the first time the US was really confronted with its own waste on a personal level. In the 10 years between 1950 and 1960, the amount of trash produced by the average individual American went up 60%. In the 20 years between 1960 and 1980, the amount of solid waste produced by the country as a whole quadrupled. The creation of new landfills became a necessity in the early 60s, and urban growth was making it increasingly more difficult to keep those landfills out of sight. Waste management was becoming an issue in the 60s that was visible in a way that it just really hadn't been before. So in 1965, Congress passed the Solid Waste Disposal Act. This was the federal government's first attempt at standardizing the country's approach to garbage, but it didn't really go much further than getting all 50 states on the same page regulations-wise. So in 1970, it was amended with the Resource Recovery Act. This act placed an emphasis on the recovery of waste over just straight-up disposal. It also set a mandate for the federal government to disperse funds to states who were struggling with waste management. The most interesting thing about the RRA, though, is that the beverage and packaging industries all sent lobbyists to testify before Congress to help get it passed. At the National Soft Drink Association State Conference in D.C. in 1970, the president of the association said this to a gathered crowd of industry members. "It is your and my container that may lay alongside of the road inviting public wrath, not the glass or the can companies. It is our trademark on it and it carries our product. They are going to be concerned with the final social consequence of your and my enterprise, and they are going to expect us to account for that consequence." Corporate lobbyists were well aware that if the crazy environmentalists weren't pacified somehow, there could be big problems. The fact that the RRA was focused on resource recovery and federal funding for waste management meant that states wanting to invest in a recycling program could be first in line for some money from the feds. And the beverage and packaging industries had much to gain from more recycling programs being fully funded. What's the environmentalist mantra? Reduce, reuse, recycle. Reduction? Obvious no. Make less stuff? make less money. Simple as that. And same for reuse. Reusable bottles were out for the beverage industry. They'd long since made the switch to disposable packaging and upped their profits by doing so. And there was an entirely new industry arising like a phoenix from the ashes of reusable products. Companies were quickly realizing that there was some easy profit to be made by throwing more things away. If a consumer can't reuse a product, they'll simply have to buy a new one. That last R, recycling, is the only part of the system that addresses packaging waste after it's already been manufactured. Recycling was the perfect solution because it didn't require any real substantial changes. But it took a while for corporate America to win the battle. The people fought back. In 1972, Oregon passed the first modern bottle bill in the nation's history, House 1036, or simply the Oregon Bottle Bill. This bill took the precedent that Vermont had set 20 years earlier and modernized it. Instead of just banning disposable bottles outright, which just wasn't very realistic in the 70s, this bill placed a 5-cent deposit on every single disposable bottle sold in the state. This was a little different from the bottle deposits of the 40s. Those focused more on incentivizing consumers to return their empties to be reused. But Oregon's bottle bill was more of a tax on the industry. The bottles weren't being sent back to the plant for reuse anymore, but could still be redeemed for a deposit by the customer, and the beverage industry was meant to cover that deposit. While this was seemingly a sound response to excessive waste, in reality the industry just passed that deposit cost on to the consumer in the form of raised prices. This still wasn't an ideal thing for them though, because generally raising prices means falling sales. A world where the public didn't even care or think about the deluge of disposable products being produced at all was still preferable to the industry over adjusting anything about their business model. So naturally, as the phenomenon of bottle bills swept the country in the 70s and 80s, so did corporate lobbying. The year before Oregon's bottle bill, in Yonkers, New York, members of the National Soft Drink Association, Coca-Cola, Pepsi, and the U.S. Brewers Association all testified before the city council to promote a recycling program instead of a proposed ban on disposable containers. They framed the whole issue as having to do with working-class jobs instead of the environment. If you regulate our production, it'll trigger catastrophic job loss. But if you start a recycling program, you'll create new jobs. It made for a compelling argument, and industry won out in Yonkers. This framing, that regulation would kill jobs, would become the industry's main weapon throughout the coming decades. From 1978 to 1989, 9 more states would successfully pass bottle bills across the country. In 1980, the House of Representatives even considered a national bottle bill that would regulate non-reusable beverage bottles nationwide. Though many industry lobbyists testified, a single lobbyist from Coca-Cola's Pacific bottling wing is largely seen as having swayed the House's decision, once again making the entire thing into a don't take our jobs issue, while also rattling on about how bottle bills actually hurt the consumer most, since bottle deposits make products more expensive. What he failed to mention, of course, is that raised prices in this case are nothing more than a refusal by the industry to pay up for their pollution. Of course, I'm saying the quiet part out loud now, retroactively. In the 80s, American recycling was still in its infancy, and a lot of environmental organizations saw it as a system worth investing in. Because corporate lobbying is quiet and largely intractable to the public, organizations like the Sierra Club and the National Wildlife Federation and Greenpeace all joined the push to generate momentum for curbside recycling. The environmental organizations always saw recycling as being the bottom of a hierarchy of a 3-part system: reduce, reuse, recycle. But by the 90s, curbside recycling had come to be seen as the be-all end-all, the only solution to America's waste problems. It wouldn't hurt jobs, it wouldn't hurt profits, no real changes would have to be made at any institutional levels, and best of all, it would trick the American public into believing the problem was being taken care of. And don't get me wrong, any recycling is better than no recycling. But the notion that recycling is some kind of magical panacea for our country's waste problem is one entirely created by corporations to pacify the public. The reality is that recycling as we know it today was implemented as a quick fix, a publicity stunt, and the real legwork required to create a recycling system that would even come close to combating America's waste production was just never done. It could have been, but that would have required a societal overhaul of unprecedented proportions. Plastics recycling, at its very core, just wasn't a feasible process. Americans had already bought the idea that recycling could be an actionable defense against the waste realities of American consumerism when materials like glass and aluminum were the main products being used. And that wasn't even really true on its own. The biggest success of the plastics industry in the last few decades of the 20th century was convincing the public that plastic was just like glass. So you've all seen this before, the recycling symbol. It's pretty commonplace, I've shown it a bunch in this video already, but you might not know where it came from. It was designed in 1970 by a college student named Gary Anderson. Gary designed it as an entry to a competition by the Container Corporation of America to raise awareness for environmental issues so they could put it on their products and advertise their products were recyclable. While this might seem like some benevolence on the CCA's behalf, it's really just an early example of a really common problem today, greenwashing, where corporations will loudly promote their ecological efforts to the public front without really making any changes in the background. And you've also seen these before. These are resin identification codes. They were created in early 1988 by the Society of the Plastics Industry as a way to differentiate and identify what specific resin a given plastic product was primarily composed of, or so they claimed. The real goal was to make plain old trash look like good recyclable untrash. The recycling symbol and the resin identification codes look basically identical, especially when 1/4 of an inch wide and embossed on the bottom of a green plastic quart container. The problem is, most of these different resins are not realistically recyclable. Some of them are technically recyclable, but have historically never been recycled at anywhere near a meaningful volume due to costs. But the average consumer didn't know all that, especially not in 1988. Most people would just flip over that empty container, see some kind of logo resembling those 3 chasing arrows, and toss it in the recycling. This was some intentionally confusing design on the part of the Society of Plastics. In recent years, the former president of the Society of the Plastics Industry, Larry Thomas, has switched sides and given a series of interviews with NPR and PBS, and has discussed at length his role in creating recycling as we know it. He was basically given a big sum of money and told to fix the problem. He's quoted in an episode of Morning Edition with NPR as saying, "If the public thinks that recycling is working, then they are not going to be as concerned about the environment." Larry's job was to convince the people it was working, and the RIC coating designs were a big part of this. If more waste was recyclable, then less waste was trash, and if by recycling your products you were creating less trash, then that meant you were doing your part. And with single-stream recycling becoming the standard around the country, consumers weren't really putting much thought about what they put into the bin. The past 3 decades of propaganda by the beverage and container industries had already done wonderful work convincing consumers that environmental concerns were better mitigated by personal righteousness than corporate change. Now the plastics industry was telling them, "You've done it, you've saved us, thank you." And they knew they could take it even further. In 1992, the American Plastics Council was born. This was a page straight from the beverage company's playbook, an industry cabal packed with plastics executives and corporate PR teams, just like Keep America Beautiful. The APC pledged a goal of raising plastics recycling rates up to 25%, a number that's never been hit to this day, by the way. And they spent $40 million 1990s dollars on PR campaigns promoting plastic products and plastic recycling over the next 4 years. Of course, behind the scenes, they were lobbying governments all around the country in opposition to regulations on their industry. Sound familiar? Eventually, in 1996, they just kind of dropped their whole pledge to get the recycling rates up and were subsequently fined by 11 different states for false advertising. But they'd lobbied successfully in opposition to regulations in 32 states, so I think there's a clear winner here. All of this PR and propaganda in the 90s predictably worked. Recycling went mainstream. Practically every company had the symbol on their products now. Most of America had curbside recycling programs implemented down to the smallest of townships. There were children's programs to instill the good deed of recycling in young minds at elementary schools all across the country. This was the new way of life. America recycles stuff. But little, if anything, was actually changing. By 1997, almost 5 times the amount of new plastic was being made as old plastic was being recycled. The problem was just getting worse. And this makes sense, as the entire American Plastics Recycling Initiative was not one born of environmental or ecological concern. Its real purpose was to pacify the public and keep the status quo alive. It was never designed to, work. Of the many different resins and polymers manufacturers like DuPont create, only 2 of them actually get recycled at high enough rates to make a dent in the production of virgin plastics: PET and HDPE, or RICs 1 and 2. And even looking at more modern numbers, recycling rates for PET plastic, or RIC1, plateau at about 28-29%. And honestly, it wouldn't surprise me if those rates are even a bit exaggerated. The only hard data I could really find for that specific RIC was from NAPCOR, the National Association for PET Container Resources. That's an industry-funded organization, so I don't really know how trustworthy they are. It's pretty hard to find data on specific RIC coating recycling rates, which honestly is part of the problem. The whole recycling and plastics industry treats RICs 1 and 2 as just the same thing as the rest of the RIC system, which just isn't true. Meanwhile, the EPA says that overall plastics recycling rates have never gotten above 9 or 10% in the entire history of plastic. And RICs 1 and 2 really are a tiny portion of all the plastic we make and throw away. They cover soda and water bottles, milk and juice jugs, and some thicker jugs like laundry detergent and dish soap, and that's pretty much it. There's 5 other categories of plastic under the RIC coating system, and the last one is other, so it's really even more than that. RIC7 is just kind of used as a catch-all for anything that's not really categorizable. Almost all of the other plastic products this country throws away get categorized as mixed plastics, and landfilled, incinerated, or very often exported. RIC5 is occasionally recycled, but it's never been anywhere close to the rate at which new plastic is produced. This is the way it is now, and this is the way it's been the whole time. Even RICs 1 and 2 can only be broken down and repurposed once or maybe twice before the material is just no longer usable. After that, it's just more mixed plastic. Compare that to the 22-way trip that the average pre-war returnable glass beverage bottle took from consumer back to bottling plant before it finally broke and could no longer be reused. Plastic is not glass 2.0. Plastic is not recyclable. But in the 20 years from 1970 to 1990, plastic waste tonnage tripled. So at the same time that plastic waste was piling up in landfills all across the country, for eco-minded folks in the 90s, recycling was the hot topic. All kinds of bizarre PSAs and PR campaigns happened in the 90s. Here's one with Ozzy Osbourne and the cartoon Yak from the 21st Annual Earth Day in 1991. B.B. King and Madonna were also in this. I think Bette Midler's in there. I'm gonna throw up some screen caps, but you should really look up the whole video on YouTube because it is something else. And of course you remember Captain Planet. By the 90s, it had become clear that corporate America had inspired the people. This wasn't just CAB or the NSDA anymore. The decades-long campaign of focused corporate messaging that a consumer's personal responsibility towards corporate-created waste could be absolved with an easily accessible solution, recycling, had gone mainstream, and its scope grew bigger than corporate propaganda. The message took on a life of its own as an integral part of American consumer culture, one that was embraced by all forms of media. In the background of the 90s green sheen, recycling rates for the last decade of the 20th century never really got above 15 or 20%, and by the early 2000s, 20 to 30% of all plastic waste was being exported to other countries each year. America wasn't even trying to deal with its own waste anymore, and it didn't matter. Waste had become benign. It wasn't the manufacturer's problem, it was the consumers. Everyone knew that, and American consumers were still diligently doing their duty by recycling. So it wasn't their problem either. Now just exactly whose problem had it become? Since the mid-80s, the US has been exporting a large portion of its plastic waste to international buyers. Up until 2018, most of our plastic waste was shipped to China, but the flow of international waste export is much broader than a simple US to China pipeline. Some early 90s international legislation, namely the Basel Convention of 1992, tried to regulate this phenomenon of global northern countries simply shipping most of their waste to the global south, with little regard for what happened to it after it left sovereign borders. The Basel Convention had some far-reaching global effects for the waste management industry, but the United States was one of 2 countries out of 189 that signed onto the treaty without ever actually ratifying it, and it remains unratified in the US to this day. Ratification is a rather complex process within US international law that I won't delve too deeply into here, But suffice it to say that without ratification, the Basel Convention holds no enforceable international consequence for the US. Even without ratification, the US initially adhered to the tenets of the treaty for the most part. The Basel Convention did have some noticeable effects on how the US could export certain types of waste, those deemed more hazardous and toxic, but it did little to regulate plastics. No difference was drawn between the bulk of plastic waste, the mixed plastics, and RICs 1 and 2. In Basel Convention terms, it all counted as recyclable plastic scrap. This created a gaping loophole for the US to export all of its trash through, regardless of how that trash would be processed abroad. Even if exported plastics were all termed recyclable when they left the country, the majority would still get incinerated or landfilled upon arrival in the global south. Shipping plastic across an ocean doesn't magically make it more recyclable. It just makes the realities of disposing of it less visible to the American public, and that's always been the goal for manufacturers of disposable products. The ease with which responsibility for plastic waste could be transferred abroad led to the exponential growth of waste exports in the 21st century, while overall domestic plastic recycling rates plummeted. In 2015, the EPA estimated that of all the plastic waste produced in the US that year, only 9% of it was recycled. And of that 9%, Hong Kong and mainland China received over half of it, some 1.6 million tons of plastic waste. The first few decades of the 21st century saw an entire new industry coalesce in China, that of buying the waste of the global north, landfilling or burning most of it, then processing what little plastic could be reused and selling back the scrap. The 2016 Chinese documentary Plastic China presents a slice-of-life portrayal of two families embroiled in the plastics recycling business. Being sparse on narration and editorialization, the film instead offers an honest glimpse into the realities of the plastics recycling industry in China, and it looks pretty grim. Children sifting through mountains of plastic trash and crafting toys from what they can save. Parents laboring over burning furnaces and toxic fumes. Poverty, wage disputes, and imbalanced access to education, substance abuse. It went viral in environmental circles in 2016 and 17, making the realities of America's waste a bit more visible once again. Just a few years after Plastic China came out, China unveiled Operation National Sword. Now it's unclear just how much one had to do with the other. The plans for National Sword had been in the works for a couple years before the doc premiered at Sundance, but the timing felt lucky. National Sword, which was launched in 2017 and didn't go into effect until mid-2018, banned 24 different kinds of scrap from being imported into China, including low-grade plastics. And because of American single-stream recycling strategies and the Basel Convention loophole wherein all plastics can be exported together as one, pretty much all plastic waste coming out of the US was classified as low-grade, even RICs 1 and 2. China was done processing America's mess, and some things were going to have to change. But not, it seems, for America. Nothing substantial really changed on the US's end after National Sword. We just found new places to dump our trash, places that were often ill-equipped to handle it. Instead of China, it started going to Malaysia and Indonesia and Vietnam and Turkey and Senegal, all countries that have difficult waste management issues on their own, without US plastics complicating things even more. So in 2019, most of the UN member countries of the Basel Convention reconvened and formed an agreement on amendments to the treaty, namely, the appropriate classification of plastic waste. After nearly 30 years, the loophole was closed. The US, unsurprisingly, was one of the few countries from the original Basel Convention that didn't participate in the amendment process. Not only did we never ratify our original commitment of 30 years ago, we won't even feign commitment to regulate plastic waste now. It's not our problem. We worked hard for this. It took decades. Do you really think we'll start taking accountability now? So that about brings us to modern day. The pandemic has of course not helped the global shipping industry one bit, and literal tons of American trash have been left to sail around the world on cargo ships for much longer than planned in some cases, bringing back the soiled memories of the Mobro 4000. Ever since the amendment to the Basel Convention, with no action from America on ratifying the treaty, American plastic exports have become technically illegal in some cases. Malaysia, the destination for the breadth of US plastic waste after National Sword, is part of the Basel Convention, but the US is still shipping plastic there. There are going to be exhaustive legal battles about this and hours of testifying and lobbying. There are whispers that Turkey is working on its own version of national sword, and other countries are likely to follow suit. The future of America's plastic waste is uncertain, but I have a prediction on how things will go, and it's not a hopeful one. Recently, it seems, Americans have peered through the wool a bit when it comes to the big trick of plastics recycling. People are starting to ask questions, to have conversations online, to make video essays. But will this new wave of public awareness be enough to fight back corporate interests? If history is any indicator, the short and simple answer is no. It's happened again and again and again. The people get upset, legislation is passed to enact regulations, and corporate America pushes it back with brute force PR and lobbying to keep the status quo alive. So be aware and be awake. Cab is still making PSAs to this day. They've got a YouTube channel just like I do. And always remember, even if you throw your plastic in the recycling after you're done with it, you're not saving the world. All right, well, for those of you still with us, thank you for watching. Just a couple quick housekeeping things here at the end. For sourcing for this paper, I did a lot of research, but most of the information came from two sources. The first one was a book by Heather Rogers called Gone Tomorrow, The Hidden Life of Garbage. The second one was a paper by Bartow, J. Elmore called The American Beverage Industry and the Development of Curbside Recycling Programs. So if you're interested in learning more about the topic, those two books would be a really good place to start. Otherwise, I tried to throw most of the relevant sources on screen during the video, but if anyone's interested in a full bibliography, just drop me a comment, I have one. Also, the title music was written by Jay Smith. I think that about covers it. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.